People who get locked into a vision. All right, that's it, man. That's their drive. That's their passion. Critics don't matter. This don't matter. They're going to do whatever it fucking takes to be the best at what they do.
This is Dave Tate with another edition of Table Talk. I'm back again with Mason. We're going to talk about more intern training stuff. But before that, I want to get to some of the questions that I had on my docket last week that I didn't get to. So we're going to tackle a few of those. Then we'll get into speaking about Conjugate, which I already have a lot of podcasts on these. So it's going to be more of a conversation dialogue than it is just spouting out how to do Conjugate. So hopefully it will take on its own life instead of just being the same crap people have heard 100 times before. So let's go with the first question that you have there, Josh.
Okay. The first question was, can you speak more about the long game, stages of a lifter's career, and how you've seen various lifters mentally navigate the climb to their peak performance and their inevitable decline from that point?
Yeah. This is one I actually prepared for a little bit before the podcast. Last week, excuse my voice, my cough, I'm getting over a cold, which oddly enough, last week I said my voice was all raspy and jacked up for some reason. Outside of being a cold, I was wrong. It was definitely a cold. Anyhow, talking about the development of a lifter, I break that down and think of it more as a development of the skill development of a lifter, because it's very easy to say this is a beginner, this is an intermediate, and this is an advanced. And then you start digging into what constitutes a beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Then you start finding out there's a whole lot of outliers where you'll have, as we discussed before, you'll have the college player that is a beginner in the weight room but advanced at their sport. So does that mean that they're intermediate? If you're around it, if you're to compromise and go with a mean or median or average or however you want to state it, that's where they would fall. And at the same time, you may have some lifters that within 2 years of competing, they're breaking all-time world records. So, or in 5 years of competing, they've already competed, they're done, they're retired, and they've accumulated dozens, if not more, all-time world records. So if you go based upon time, that, well, you're a beginner for about the first 2 or 3 years, well, then what the fuck is this person that's breaking all-time world records after 3? Are they a beginner? Because they're kicking everybody else's ass. So, and this is more than just outliers. It's an outlier to me is like one rare oddity where there's a lot of people that will just train for 2 or 3 years and be hands down better than people who have been training for 10 or 15 years. Is all that genetics? Can be debated. There's a lot of factors that go into play there, but it's more than just training age. It's more than just strength and so forth. So the easier way that I like to look at it is, how does somebody acquire the skill or skill development to be able to progress, if it's lifting or any other sport for that matter, in a progressive state. So generally, if you look at how an athlete learns, what the learning process is, I have notes here I'm going to kind of look back to, so I'm not completely going from the hip. They're going to learn from instruction or cues. So the way that I've always broke it down and make it very simple is somebody's going to have to be told and shown how to do it first. And they may need those cues and instruction over and over again until they can begin to respond to the cues and then begin to restate the cues themselves, and then restate the cues themselves without somebody reinforcing them, and then those cues become automatic. There's more to it than just that, but if you think of it as 3 phases, that's the easiest way to kind of break down the basic psychology of skill development and how it kind of all lays out. But the way it really breaks down in more detail is they're going to learn with instruction. That's really even before cues. You're just going to say, here is how you do this. And that's where, as a coach, you have to understand, are they going to learn from visual learning or audible learning? How do they learn? Some people will learn more because they have to see themselves do it or they have to see somebody else do it. Other people can learn just by giving them cues and saying, do this and do that. One big tell is, and this is why I like teaching the squat before I teach anything else, because the squat kind of traps people a little bit. They can't move a whole lot of things. Their feet are on the ground, their hands are on the bar. You can't really do a whole lot. So if you're teaching them how to squat and you stand off to the side, which is typically what I'll do every single time, and if you're telling them, okay, look, I want you to stand upright, I want to breathe into your stomach and so forth, then you see them look towards you, then they're going to be more of a visual learner than they're going to be an audible learner. So from that standpoint, you need to stay, for a couple reasons, you need to stay in their line of sight, because you don't want them twisting their head to the right every time they squat. So every time you're going to give instruction, they're going to look towards you. So at this point, you would stand in front to be able to keep the head in a good position. But personally, what I do is I change my tone and I change the verbiage that I'm using from, hey, I want you to, push your feet into the ground like you're pushing sand through a beach, or whatever cue you're going to learn. Instead of me saying push your feet down, I will start to begin to say things like picture yourself pushing your feet down. So I'm going to play into what their tell is, that I've learned from that, and if that's not that, and I start telling people, look, visualize or see yourself pushing your feet down, and they don't learn that way, they're just going to laugh at me. They're going to think it's stupid and it's funny. It's not going to connect. Where the other people, it will connect. So in hindsight with this, to fall back, sometimes you'll have to film them and say, hey, look here, this is what you have to do, because some people will have to see themselves do it, which is going to take a little bit more time, or see somebody else do it and so forth. So these are all things that you can pick up on pretty easily. It's going to be easier for me, I suppose, because I've done thousands and thousands of lifters doing this. But if you just pay attention to what people are doing, you'll see these tells, and they're not subtle. They're pretty transparent if you're paying attention to that. But that's the first step, is they're going to learn with cues. I suppose you could learn somebody reading it in a book and then trying to duplicate it, or watching a video and try to duplicate it. There's that standpoint as well. But with that, there's going to become the auto suggestion. So the cues are going to start to become more condensed. So instead of being a cue of, drive your chin into your neck, look at the top of the E, drive your feet down, keep your hips stable, flex your ass, you got a whole host of things. They're going to start to come down to where some things they're going to do automatically just by default, some things they're not. So you're going to take out the things that they're doing automatically by default, and you're going to reinforce the things that they need reinforced. So there's no sense in having a mental checklist of 30 different things if 24 of the things are being done automatically. So you just pull those out, then you take the checklist from drive your head back and your chin into your neck, or whatever it is, to just chin, whatever's going to stick with them, to be able to condense that down so it can become a standpoint of, chin back, knees, feet, or whatever it's going to be that works for them. It's condensed down. And this is where it gets real tricky when people ask things, well, what cues should I use when I squat? I don't fucking know. It's different for everybody based upon how they respond to the cue, which is kind of what I'm talking about here. And B, is the cue condensed as much as it can possibly be? Once they get to that point where they're responding to the cues, and that's a whole thing there, that you never even know if they're really responding or not, because they will tell you they are while they're not, or think of it this way. If you've ever been cued on any lift, first off, did you really hear what the fuck they were saying? And then B, did you actually do it? Most people who are honest with themselves about this are going to say maybe 30% of the time they did. But they get what they say after the set, then they try to apply it the next one. And that's where the repetition comes in. When it gets enough repetitions, it's going to become automatic. Kind of as I said before, you want to have suggestion and then automatic. And then, I'm sorry, not automatic, I'm getting ahead of myself. When the lifter or the athlete starts cueing themselves. So now they're in there, and you can still be chatting and, yapping away all you want. And, in their mind, they're running through a mental checklist to be able to do what they have to do. And they can maintain that mental checklist on a pretty consistent basis until something goes wrong. And then when something goes wrong, if there's, a mental voice in their head, let's say it's, chin, abs, back, knees, head, up, and then it starts to come halfway up, or whatever point it's going to be in the lift where it goes bad. And then instead of the cue on how to fix it, the cue is, oh, fuck, or this is heavy. The voice comes in that basically says you just got beat, instead of the voice coming in that says, okay, I'm fucked, how do I get out of it? So that becomes curtailing that voice. That self-talk in your head is only going to come from experience of being in that position and being able to get yourself out of that position. With, powerlifting and strength points and so forth, sometimes just, grinning, bearing, and pushing as hard as you can is going to get the person through that. Sometimes if that's, a grind that's going to take a little bit of time, and all they're doing is grinning, bearing, and pushing through it, but they're not trying to make whatever adjustment they have to make to push through, they're going to end up missing. There's no need to get frustrated if they're not conditioned to the point to be able to make that adjustment, because all the other things are automatic. The goal that you're trying to strive to achieve is for all those things to become automatic, so they don't have to think about it. Then when the situation arises that's unconventional or whatnot, what they're not used to, they can mentally address that, because they don't have to mentally address all these other things that don't take the effort anymore. To apply it to a different sport, basketball season's still going on, kind of, right? So we're getting into the playoffs and stuff like that. So the difference between, a great basketball player and a beginner or intermediate is the great basketball player has all the basic skills automatic. So when they need to use a skill that's not automatic, they can pull on that skill and have the mental bandwidth to be able to do that. When they don't have the mental bandwidth to be able to do that, because it's all being absorbed on making sure all the basic skills are attacked, and addressed, they're not going to be able to have that. That's where the power of repetition comes into play, why people have to do things over and over and over and over. So as they move through that learning process, I already mentioned being able to do the auto suggestion. So let's say that you're being able to do the auto suggestion with speed. You have to do it with speed before you can do it with strength. So because speed, displaying strength comes from, displaying speed, moving something fast, because moving something fast is essentially the same as moving something with force. You move something slow, then that's typically what happens with bigger weights and so forth. But you have to apply that maximum force. And the other aspect of this is you can't train with 95% plus weights all the time, to be able to condition that skill to be developed from that standpoint. And if the other thing with speed is, and I'm not talking dynamic effort work here, I'm just talking speed in general. Most sports happen at that live speed. So you can think your way through a lift in slow motion or a skill in slow motion pretty effectively and pretty easily. And that's how most skills are actually taught, in powerlifting and weightlifting. A lot of times the technique's going to be taught from in reverse to forward. So from eccentric to concentric, because it's easier to learn from that standpoint. It's easier to learn opposite than it is the other way around. So case in point, if you want to teach a gen pop person that hasn't lifted in 15 years how to squat, you're going to have a much greater success teaching them a sit to stand, so sitting on the chair and standing up, than you are going to be able to teach them from a standing position sitting down. This is one of the reasons why the sit to stand is one of the first things a physical therapist will teach if somebody's in the hospital coming off of illness and so forth, because you have to be able to stand up before you can be able to walk. And that's, anyhow, you have to learn it with speed, and then after the speed, you have to be able to learn it with speed strength, and you have to be able to learn it in a fatigue state. So that's going to display differently in strength sports than it would, wrestling, for example. Wrestling, you're going to be in a fatigue state most of the time, in the third period. So you still have to be able to apply those skills and that technique in a fatigue state for it to actually really matter. Like, again, anybody can do proper technique slowly with no fatigue, and a decent warm-up without any problem. Now, can they do that fast in a fatigue state? That's a whole nother animal as far as that goes. And can they do it fast in a fatigue state with maximal strength? That's a whole nother. All these are part of that learning process. It's all part of that maturing process. It's the difference between being a beginner and that advanced lifter that I was talking about at the very beginning. So how does that advanced lifter become that advanced lifter? It's because they can do what I'm talking about. They can display that technique in a fatigue state, with speed and maximal strength, in a failure, and close to failure situation, and still be able to display that. That's why they are where they are. So if you want to think backwards on this a little bit, take somebody that is a high-level beginner or intermediate and watch them in their own training and conditioning. Or if you want to apply it to a different sport, watch it during their practice. And then ask yourself, how much better of a player or a lifter would this person be if they executed the technique flawlessly, without getting stronger and without getting faster? But all they did was execute the technique flawlessly. Significantly. They're going to be significantly better. But that takes, skill, it takes time, it takes practice. Yes, genetics play a part in that and so forth. The ability to learn is a big part of that as well. The ability to, the coachability of the person, how the person learns, all these things are a factor in that. That's with the original question, that's the difference between the beginners and the advanced from a more thought out process instead of just vomiting something on a table, because you have to think further than here's this here and these defined sets of rules that are going to determine where somebody falls. Because if you want to help somebody get from beginner to intermediate or intermediate to advanced, you need to know how to be able to help them. And if you can determine where they fall on that spectrum of that learning process, and then say, okay, this person currently is able to, display solid technique, but they can't do it when they're fatigued, and they can't do it with, maximum strength, but they can do it with speed. So there's an overreaching sticking point, which is technical. Again, as I said before, everybody wants to say, what exercise do I need to do to be able to become better? This, I think, is expanding upon the idea of, technical is usually the issue 70% of the time, because right there is a prime example of how it's part of the solution before throwing in a bunch of other exercises, because you can throw in all these other exercises, you can make all these other muscles, and you can make all the body stronger, and they're still going to have that inability to be able to display that strength under extreme fatigue, because this is a mental process that goes into learning as well as a physical process. So it has to be addressed to be able to move them forward. So that's a very long answer to the question, but I wanted it to be a long answer so people see that this is more than just a beginner is somebody that lifts for, it's a terrible question to answer. You get asked that all the time. It gets probably the number one question that somebody's ever asked. And I had a DM about it the other day, is everybody wants to know, what did you lift when you were my age? Everybody wants to know. It's so fucking insignificant. It's ridiculous. It has it doesn't matter. It has no significance. But I don't know what I know why they're asking, but.
Have you answered any of them?
I used to, but I don't answer them. Now I can just send them to open powerlifting and go look at the list and see where you rank and just work up from there. They don't want to know my answer. All right. What was one of the other ones?
All right. Next one on the list. Can you speak in the risk and rewards associated with lifting?
Yeah. And this isn't just lift. Again, all these things can apply to sports and can apply to everything else. There's a risk reward ratio to everything. And you hear people talk about it all the time, and it's become part of normal dialogue. You have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, or whatever the fuck that means, because I never really understood that one, because if you become comfortable, then you're not uncomfortable. It's just, it doesn't make sense to me as far as how that whole thing's put together. But what I do know is when people do, think about risk reward, they never look at the risk seriously. It's like, okay, here's what the reward can be. And they're all about that. But they'll look at the risk and say, okay, here's all the things that could potentially happen, but not to me. Or, I'm going to minimize, all the risks. And that's fair. That's what we all do. You all want to minimize the risk. But the word minimize does not mean eliminate all of the risks. So there's a reason why there's the word risk and the word reward. There's always that price, and, God forbid you don't have to pay the price, but don't act like you didn't know what it was. Don't do something for, several years and 10 years, 20 years, or whatever it was, and say, fuck, I didn't know. What do you mean you didn't know? Did you didn't know that this could be a potential risk? And in all cases, the people will tell me, well, yeah, I did, but what? You didn't think it would happen to you? So you really didn't look at the risk reward? Because if you want to get rid of every risk associated with whatever activity you're doing, don't do it. Simple. Don't do it. Yes, you definitely want to minimize it. And that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when it's a risk reward, you have to think about it and understand that this is something that you're willing to, a road you're willing to go down, knowing that this is a potential impact of that. It's a potential result. That's a side effect. I don't know the word I'm really looking for. Risk. It's a potential risk. And in business, we learn a little bit differently, because the risk reward's always associated with the financial aspect. So it's like, okay, if we do this, what's the risk? Well, we lose everything. Fuck. Do we really want to do this, or do we want to do some, but it's there, and there's some things that you can do in business where you're not going to lose everything. You're not, and that worst case scenario, you're not going to lose every dollar that you have in the bank, worst case scenario. And that, I don't think, is what people look at if they make a decision to embark on, a sport, a career, whatever it's going to be. They don't look at the risk from the standpoint of what is the worst thing that could happen, and am I okay with it? Am I okay if I'm that 1%? Here's the tricky thing with that is, no, I'm not okay if I'm, then okay, you don't do it. But on the other end of the coin, are you okay if you're going to be that 1% that gets the maximum benefit over and above everybody else? Of course, everybody is, so that's a balance, so it's something that I guess I learned very, very early on is with that. And it's probably one of the reasons why I don't have any real regrets, except maybe, except one, but that's it. And I even knew I even knew the risk of what the regret that I did earn from that is, knowing that. And yeah, I've fallen on the short end, of that risk reward several times. I'm fucking okay with it, because I knew this was something that could happen. I'm not going to sit and say, fuck, holy me, I can't believe, what the hell you mean you can't believe? You just, I don't get it. So from that standpoint, I think it's more an internal dialogue that needs to be expanded upon instead of ignored and what would you call it when you kind of like don't pay attention to it? Indifferent, is I think what most people really are. Is they don't necessarily ignore it, they're just indifferent. They don't even think about it. They just that's the greatest thing about being indifferent. That's the ultimate not giving a fuck, because you really don't give a fuck that you don't even know what it is. So I think if there's some cognitive thought about that, then if that time comes to where you have to pay that price, you're going to be okay with that. And then you won't be asking the questions such as, why did this happen to me and all this other kind of stuff. It doesn't matter. It's just pulled the short end of the stick. Somebody has to. If somebody has to pull, the big stick, somebody's got to pull the short one. It's the name of the game. The other one.
Okay, last one on here. What do you feel is missing from how lifters approach their lifting in today's strength world?
I kind of know the answer. So how do I want to hit the answer? I've been in this powerlifting thing in one form or another for this spring will be 40 fucking years. I've been around. I started training my first meet 40 years ago. That's fucking old. So I've seen things come, go, come back again, go, come back again, so many times. Probably some things that are kind of big things, I'm now seeing like the third iteration of the same trend all over again. And the first couple times you don't know any better because you haven't really seen it. You don't pay that much attention to it. Now you see it all over. And it doesn't even faze me. It was like, whatever, here we go again, just round and around. Anyhow, the biggest thing, because if I want to look way back, to today, and a lot of things have changed, and most things have changed for the better. There's no doubt in my mind they've changed for the better. There's more information, which I don't think is a bad thing. You just have to learn how to decipher the information. I don't think that's even that hard. I really don't. It's like, if you can't tell something's complete utter bullshit, then I don't know what to tell you. I really don't. If you're in the field and you're treating it professionally, like you want to learn from it, you're going to be able to determine what's kind of bullshit and what's not bullshit from that standpoint. I would rather have a whole lot of stuff to determine what's bullshit and what's not bullshit, and then have to wait every month for a new magazine to come out, and then to walk to the bookstore to get the magazine, and and textbooks and all the other stuff. Now it's so much stuff that you see a lot of different viewpoints, where coming up through for me during the younger times, I didn't see, maybe I did see a lot of different viewpoints, but it wasn't at the same time. Say high intensity training was in vogue, so that was the popular thing, or high volume training, and that was the popular thing, or you stumble across something, then you do a deep dive on that. And so I guess in one aspect, it was probably easier for me to do deep dives on stuff because I wasn't exposed to so many different things at one time, where now people are exposed to so many different things that I don't think they do a deep dive really on anything unless they decide, I want to try this. And then they start to do a little bit of deep dive until it gets a little technical, then they don't want to do it anymore. But at least they do some. But I think most people just get stuck on the surface level of everything. And that kind of touches upon what I think is the biggest difference, and that is personal accountability. And this, I think, began to become more of an issue in the last half decade, since maybe 2010, 2015, half decade, kind of in that range. And where we're at just looking at a powerlifting perspective, because that's where I have the greatest history in. Strength and conditioning is maybe 10 years less than what that is. But from the powerlifting perspective, the personal accountability was huge, really up until about 10 years ago. And if somebody wanted to become better as a lifter, they had to learn how to become a better lifter, or find somebody to train with that was a better lifter. And they had to figure out how it was going to work for them to make them better. Now they just hire a coach. And, there's benefits to that and there's negatives to that. But, the overreaching issue that begins to expose itself is you see a bigger attrition than ever before, because people are coming into the sport and this may be true in strongman, and it's probably true in bodybuilding. I can pretty safely say that. Strongman, I don't know. But, they come in and they don't think they can compete unless they have a coach, which means they're never going to compete in their life unless they have a coach, ever. And so all that accountability that they were going to take now gets shifted to the coach. Now, granted, yes, they still have to show up. They still have to do the work. They still have to do all those things. But somebody's telling them, that's what you do. This is what you need to do. And if adjustments need to be made, they're going to make the adjustments. So they're never going to learn how to make the adjustments and all these different things. And that's a huge part of the process. Maybe it's my bias. Maybe it's, my age and the experience and how I came up shining through there. I'm not ignorant enough to not know that could be a big part of this. But I do think that there's a problem where people won't compete or think they won't compete unless they have a coach. And if we move that forward several years, which I think that we've seen in powerlifting over the past 5, which is what I'm talking about. Now those people who are in the industry that used to be those people that would, help other people in the gym, show them how to power lift, say, here, go read this, program or do this program, and, basically guide them, on how to do their meet, are now people that have never had anybody do that for them. They always had to pay. So now that they've been doing it for 5 years, there's no fucking way they're going to help somebody else because they had to pay for everything that they know. So that's where we're at now, is if somebody's coming into the sport, it's very hard for them to find somebody that's going to help them without some type of monetary compensation. Even if it's they join a gym and whatever the gym fee is going to be, more than likely, if they want to be part of the powerlifting club, they're going to have to pay more. Or if they want to have the powerlifting training, they're going to have to pay more for that. It's not everywhere, but most places that's the case. So if we, keep moving 5 years from now, that's no longer going to exist. If you join a gym, you're going to be able to pay X amount per month, and that's just to be able to use the place. But if you want to actually compete in powerlifting, you have to come during, these times and pay this much more, for that service, and that's what it's going to be. And which, fine. I mean, if that's the direction that the sport is going to go, and that's the direction that's going to make it grow and so forth, that's fine. It's cool. But what are you going to do about the people that can't afford it? Because I couldn't, for 15 fucking years, of my career, I couldn't. There's no way I could afford it. Fuck, I couldn't even afford. It was hard for me to afford paying Louis $40 a month or whatever the gym dues were to keep the heat on, while I was there, let alone have to pay him, to be able to be in there. I couldn't fucking do that. So what happens to all those people? They no longer compete anymore. So that's the biggest thing. So I don't blame it on the coaches, because there's got to be a market. All right. And if there's a market of people that are willing to pay and they're going to pay, then somebody's going to charge. That's just the way the whole thing works. I blame it on the people who are paying. If the people that are paying need to take more personal accountability and responsibility, go ahead and pay the coach, but ask questions. Figure out why they're having you do the things that you're doing specific to you. Figure out how you're going to be able to do this if you love the sport and you love the training. How are you going to do it if the coach isn't there for a year? Or is the coach helping you to become independent so you can do it on your own, so you can learn? Because, big light bulb moment, for you, personally, and this is my bias, but it's really fucking strong on this one. I'll admit it on all the other ones, but it's really strong on this one. People are going to have a really hard time convincing me otherwise. For the vast majority of people to get to the level that they're really being the best they can be, they're going to have to auto-regulate their own training. They're going to need to know what the fuck they're doing and why they're doing it, and then be able to make those changes. And for most people, that's not going to happen right away. It's going to take a lot of time. It very possibly is going to take a coach to be able to show them how to do that and how to get to that level. But somebody has to, because if you don't eventually get to that level, you're never going to be the best that you can possibly be. So I put the blame actually on the lifter, the consumer, for they need to take more accountability and responsibility for their own program. This crap of I just don't want to worry about it. I got other shit to do. That's cool if that's a hobby and you just want something to do for exercise. I get that. I get real busy too. It's like, fuck it, I just want to train. Somebody else just tell me what the fuck to do. I get that, but I realize it's very non-optimal. But it's better than zero. But if you're trying to, I'm just going to talk in circles, so I'm going to stop there. All right. So where do we go from here?
That was all the questions we had pre-queued up.
Okay.
So we do have some from the live stream, but I figure we can.
No, if they're related to any of those three, let's hit those now.
Okay, let me look through them.
I guess if I knew the words, I could sing that song, Lime in the Coconut, right?
Yeah. Pull that up, Mason. It looks like a lot of them, there's a lot of good questions here, but they're pretty specific.
That's all right. What's one?
Let me see here. Does your max really matter for dynamic effort movements? Should you swap it for repeated effort if you are an early intermediate?
Your max does matter for dynamic effort, but this is going to be a good segue because we're going to talk about Conjugate. And to me, the best way to structure a Conjugate program is to start with the dynamic work. The max matters because it's going to determine the weight that you're going to use for the dynamic training. But, when you're dealing with, there we go, 1 rep maxes or perceived maxes, competitive, here's where the issue starts. What max are we talking about? Are we talking about a competitive max? Are we talking about a training max? Are we talking about a perceived max? Obviously, competitive max, what's going to be done in a competition, that should be a little bit higher than anything that's going to be in a gym. A training max is going to be a max that's done in the gym with normal mental environment, no super psych or anything like that. There's no, deload, I guess you would call. There's no peaking with the training max. A perceived max would be a max based upon what you think that you can do. So there's a lot of, then there's RPE, perceived exertion, and then there's the percentage-based scaling type of max, where you look at a percentage chart, say you triple this, you should be able to do this. There's a certain degree of variance that you're going to be able to get away with if you're doing dynamic effort work, and that's because it's done with submaximal weight most of the time. There's circummax phases, which is a different conversation. So you got a little room to play there. What I generally recommend is I like things to be in 3-week waves or 3-week cycles, however you want to define those. So the trick becomes, what are the percentages going to be for the 3 weeks? And some people are going to tell you, and you can look at a lot of different resources, you're going to see they're kind of all over on the map. Some people will say 40, 45, 50% over three weeks. Others will say 50, 55, 60. Some you'll see 60, 65, 70. And sometimes it'll even go as high as 80, 70, 75, 80. And so there's huge confusion. Some points it could be 20, 25, 30. I've seen everything all over the map. So it's no wonder people are really fucking confused. Here's the way to kind of get around all that is, instead of the 3-week wave, do the first wave that you do on a 4-week wave. And whatever the repetitions are going to be, say it's for the bench press, you're going to do 3s. On the squat, you're going to do 2s. Those are generally the most popular. Those are the ones that I used at Westside for forever. There were cycles that we did of 5s, and there were, other things, but those are pretty much what we did most of the time. I don't do those all the time now, but for sake of conversation, that's what I'm going to say. Do the first set with 45% and pay attention to how the bar moves. You want to move it with as most force as you possibly can while keeping your technique as solid as you can. So does that set feel like the weight's too light? Are your shoulder blades, say it's a bench, are your shoulder blades coming off the bench at the top? You stupid heap thing. You see people do that crap all the time. Little side note, people make me laugh when they take the bar and push it like 1,000,000 miles an hour. It's like you're not impressing anybody that you can move the bar super fast. I get it, but you'll see their body, will jump. It's like, oh, got it, the bar, whatever. But basically, is the speed so fast that it's compromising good technique? Because if the weight is too light, what's going to happen? It's going to kind of go all over the place. So do it with whatever I said, 40, 45, 50. Each set go up 5%. So 40, 45, 50, 55, and keep working up. And as you keep working up, keep the rest periods, nothing super, super long, but nothing super constricted either. So 60 to 90 seconds. And you're 60, 65. As you work up, there's going to become a point in time where it's not going to feel that it's moving with the same force as the other ones. When that force begins to drop, stop, because now you're sacrificing your technique because the weight is too heavy. All right. And what you'll find is you might have a range between 55 and 65% where the bar moves damn perfectly every time. You're able to display great force with those. There's your range specific to you, so now you break that into 3 weeks. That's going to weigh, 50, 60, 65%. There you go. There's your 3 weeks. How are you going to do any better than that? You see what I'm saying? Yeah. You can do that. And as I was talking about a little bit earlier, talking about personal responsibility, accountability, and all that, you can do all that. And if you do it and you know how it felt in the lighter range and the heavier range to know what your optimal range is, and you can read somebody else's stuff saying you need to train in this range or this range, you shouldn't be swayed by that because you already know from what you were doing what felt right. So that answers the questions about the percentages. Yes, it matters, but everybody's percentage is going to be a little different based upon, and it's not really, I hate to say, I do it because people understand it. I hate to say everybody, because if I had a group of 60 athletes, they're going to fall within about 3 different categories of grouping with that percent that I'm talking about. So it's not necessarily everybody. So, but this is where those percentages evolve from. You'll take a coach that works with a set number of athletes that typically fill the same type of demographic as far as intermediate, beginner, advanced, different skill sets, different sports, different strength sports even. And then they're going to tell you these percents, and they're derived from the demographic that they work from all the time, because they're telling you, here's what I see. And as I said, if I had a group of, 100 football players, there's probably going to be 3 different groups, and there's going to evolve. And I would be able to say, here's this for this percent, here's this. Most people who are going to be listening to me are either coaches that are trying to figure out what those groups are. Well, there you go. I just told you. Or the athlete that wants to know what percentage that they should do. Well, there you go. It takes care of that. Where now that information that you're reading, you can use that more specifically based upon the broad themes that they're speaking about, where when you're talking about programming, you want to look at the broad themes, not the specific metrics. So the specific metrics being specific percentages, specific workload, specific volumes, specific, because those are all going to be based, you know what I'm saying, on that demographic. And isn't that why we read research studies? So you read the research study, then after you read the study, you get that broad overview, then you want to know, okay, what was the demographic? Then you go, or what was the sample size and demographic? Then you go look and like, oh, wait a fucking minute. This is 3 people that I never trained before. This don't mean a goddamn thing. All right. And then, but maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. You know, that's kind of the whole thing. But we're pretty much all keen enough to know to do that if it's a research summary. You know, very few people I know in the profession of string sports, whatever you want, all those different professions, are going to read a research summary and say, yeah, it's something. I don't want to say not everybody, but something. Yes, this is definitively the truth. Most people are going to say, oh, wow, this is interesting. Where does it come from? Mm-hmm. And then they're going to go look, and may not read the whole thing, but they're going to at least look at those things. You know, then it's a whole nother skill set to know if this is bullshit. You know, there's always ways to present numbers to get results that may not necessarily be what the results are, but that's beyond my skill set. That's where I send it to other people and say, what the fuck? Then they come back and always point something out that you never see. And so you should, you know, if you're a strength coach or somebody in this profession, you should find somebody that really knows how to read or do research, real research. I'm not talking about Google research, you know, but real research, because there's a lot of crazy shit that will go on in studies that are very, very hard for most people to be able to see just how slated it really is. But that's another topic. You got anything else?
There was one more that related kind of to, at least to Conjugate. This guy is saying, I recently switched from Conjugate to 531 due to time constraints, and now being in a commercial gym. So what are your tips, if any, for going to Conjugate to 531?
I don't know if my tips are going to really be about that. You know, the bigger issue here is, you mentioned time constraints. So I'm going to give the tips towards that. Make sure you're adhering to your rest periods, you know, because that's going to allow you to get a lot more work in than what you think you can get in. You know, that's a big oversight for most people, especially when they're in a gym setting. You'll get involved in a conversation and stuff like that. And that should be factored in to the training time, because there are ways to avoid it, and it should be avoided during certain times of training, but other times of training, you really don't need to avoid it, because it is a community, I guess you can say. But it still is a place to train. You know, there's a difference between training and working out. So to think that you're going to go in there and just adhere to the sets, reps, rest periods, and there's going to be no other time that's going to be wasted is a fallacy, no matter what level the athlete is, unless it's a sport training center and they're working with a coach. But I'm still going to tell you, there's fucking time wasted, you know, from there as well. And if you don't factor that in, it's a problem. But most of the time, it's twice where it needs to be from that standpoint. And that can just be the bullshitting that you do before you get in, you know. So what I would suggest is, if there's some consistency on when you train, say you're going to be at the gym at 5, have a defined start time. All right, you're going to get to the gym at 5, but at 5:30 we start, bottom line. And then stick to that. It's easier to do if it's just you as a person than if you're waiting for other people and stuff like that. But have that defined start time, because that can save you 15 minutes quick. And if you're actually only training for 45 minutes, which is actually a lot of training time if you're actually training, that's a third, you know, of your training time. And same thing with, you're going to stop at X time. So say you're going to stop at 6 p.m., you know, have a defined time that you need to be the fuck out of there. So I'm going to stop at 6, but I have to leave at 6:30. and then get out. And that, you're going to find from that standpoint, your time management is going to not be as big of an issue as you think it is. So focus more on that than how to change training parameters, so to say, because I have a feeling what you're going to find is, first off, I have a feeling this isn't the first time you left one program to another program because of time constraints. So I'm guessing here, but I think it's a pretty solid assumption. And it's probably not going to be the last time. So you're going to do this 5-3-1 for a while. You're going to say, you know what, this is taking still too much time. Then you're going to move to something else, where the reality is you could probably do any program within the time constraints that you have. You just have to work on the time management aspect.
Okay. There was one more that came in. So the previous one talking about doing dynamic effort if your maxes aren't high, he wanted to clarify and said he was asking if he should do dynamic work if his maxes aren't high because he's heard from several coaches that you shouldn't do dynamic effort if your squat is below 500.
No. I disagree. I mean, if that's the case, nobody's going to fucking train.
What about the lighter people too?
It's relative. I mean, you're
several coaches.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's step back here a little bit, because you can get a very skewed vision when all you see are powerlifters. Most football players across the board, from junior high to the NFL, most probably don't squat 500 pounds. So with that assumption there, if I moved it to 600, I would be more confident in saying most don't. I'm not as confident with the 500. 600, I would definitely be confident in saying most don't. But from that standpoint, your perception of strength, and one of my first articles ever, by the way, was called Strength, and it dealt with perception of strength, because this is actually cool to have this conversation, because years ago when I wrote that, the perception was different. People were thinking, man, a 500-pound squat, that's fucking huge. And the story goes back to, I was speaking at a strength and conditioning conference and heard coaches talking about this as they were looking at the record boards in the football strength and conditioning room. And I'm looking at them like, oh my God, this sucks. I mean, they were the biggest squat up there was like 5 1/4. These coaches were impressed because they were so big. So I'm driving home, and actually my wife was driving home. I'm fucking pissed. I'm like, I can't believe people think that's a fucking bench. I can't believe they think this is good. So I'm tapping this article out like, come on, man. The perception here has to change a little bit. But so I'm glad that this is now an issue. Okay. But at the same time, there has to be perspective in there, because if you start saying people can't do certain training programs because they're too weak for the program, I don't understand that, because if the program is to help somebody get stronger, how are you too weak for the program? That would be the same as saying somebody's too strong to be able to do a program. And essentially what happens with this whole thing is it's just a bullshit excuse for people to justify their bias. So if I'll use Westside because I'm closer to that, and I took more heat about that probably than anybody over a period of time. It used to be the only program that you could do if you were a powerlifter. It's only made for powerlifters. And then for a while, it's like, this shit ain't good for powerlifting. Okay, then who the fuck is it good for? Well, so it's used by all these, the athletes. It's used by coaches and football players. Okay, but 10 years ago, it was only good for powerlifting. Well, it's only good for multi-ply. Oh, okay, now it's multi-ply powerlifting, and that's it. So now it's only good for like 555 people in the whole fucking world. That's it. It's not good for all these other. Or let's not use that. Let's use 5-3-1. 5-3-1's great for beginners, but it's not good for anybody else. Okay, wait 4 or 5 years, and you're going to see, oh man, 5-3-1, it's not for beginners. You need to have 5 or 6 years training experience before you do something like that. Every program goes through this this stuff. And you'll never hear the person say, hey man, the program I have my kids do, that's not good for beginners. They'll also never say it's not good for advanced people. They're going to say their program's fucking good for everybody. Right?
Yeah.
All right. So, but everybody else's program isn't good for anybody. All right. Theirs is the only program that's good. Yet, in the global aspect of strength and conditioning, less than 0.00001% of all people do their program. But it's the only one that works. Yet they're getting their ass kicked by all these other people. Because you see what I'm saying? It's just, you got to look at this shit sometimes, you know, from a more global view instead of being right in the middle of all of it. Because when you're in the middle of all of it, all you see is the little bullshit drama going back and forth. And you got to step back and say, look, how would somebody, you know, with alien intelligence, you know, beyond ours, look at this and be like, oh my God, it's all fucking training, guys, you know, and kind of go from that perspective. So I hope that answers this. The best program is the program that's going to work for the group that you're working with. So if you're a coach that's working with 100 kids, you got to accept the basic reality that it's not going to work for every kid. It's going to work to a degree, but it's not going to be optimal for every kid. And more than likely, you're not going to be able to make it optimal for every kid. You have to understand that. So how can you create a program that's going to work for the majority of the kids that are there, and then hope that that majority is going to be keen enough to be able to help the minority get better, you know, and build it that way instead of trying to structure something that's going to work for every single person, because optimally what's that going to do? It's going to work less for the majority, you know, and the goal is to be able to make the whole program better, you know, from that standpoint. It's the reality. Did I answer that?
I'd say so.
All right.
So we got a ton more questions. Do you want to get to the part with Mason here and cover them all at the end, or what are you thinking?
Give me a couple more and I'll just slam them. Conjugate.
Okay. So another good one was any advice about, let me put this on me. Any advice about bracing during a heavy front squat? Anything over 305, I struggle to get a deep bracing breath.
Is he still on right now?
Red Devil Z22, if you're still on.
Are you using a front squat harness or a barbell or a safety squat? But tell me how you're doing the front squats.
All right, so we'll come back to that if he comes back to us. Another one on a similar topic. Let me see. I just had it. Hold on a second here. I can't find it, but it was something about having trouble bracing and staying tight when he's doesn't have a monolith. Any advice for that?
Wow, that's fucked up. Normally I'll hear the opposite of that.
Let me see if I can find the exact one, but keep going.
Because in one aspect, bracing and staying tight can be seen as two different things. It depends upon who you're talking to. So I'm just going to take this as staying tight. And this is typically harder for people to do in a monolith than it is if they're walking out. Because when they're walking out, just the movement alone allows for activation. If you're having a hard time, you know, staying tight and when you're in or using a monolith, then understand that the monolith, you have to be tight before you take anything out. So if you want to use a percent just to kind of put this in some type of, you know, mental visual perspective, you should be 80% of your maximum tightness before the bar even comes out of the monolith. Now, by that, I'm not talking about the tightness that's going to be created once you take it out and all that load gets absorbed on your frame. You know, that changes as far as what the tightness is. But let's say you're just 40%, and then you stand up with it, and then they release it, and you either tilt your hips, bend your knees, you know, however you're going to begin the lift, and then you you move that first joint, everything comes on you. It's going to feel like a ton of bricks because you haven't got all that tight first. So without seeing how you do things, what I try to tell people to do and fail most of the time, but it does work when they get it right, is to get everything tight. Make sure your feet are tight. You know, they're grounded. Your hands are grounded. Your back's flexed. You know, your torso's flexed. You know, you're trying to break your belt, which is, you know, cues are cues. Take it for what it's worth. As I've stated many times before, different cues work for different people. It just depends on it. But if you're thinking about trying to break your belt, you know, snap it off from that standpoint, it helps if somebody can learn to pull as much air as they can with their nose first, and then right when the monolith, you know, right when you start to make your pick, breathe that little bit more as you can through your mouth, then you're good to go. And once you're good to go, if you're stable, go. But if you're not, you have to hold it until you become stable. So if you watch, you know, a powerlifter using a monolith, many times you'll hear, you know, their back spotter or somebody say, hold, go. And what they're watching is the bar. So if the bar's moving, you don't go, because you got to let that movement stop and become grounded before you go. Because if it's moving anyway in the slightest bit, then that's just going to be compounded throughout the eccentric. So you got to let it stop, stabilize before you can go. As soon as it stops, go. Some people can go straight out and it's stopped, but it's pretty rare. So the other thing you might be doing is you might be getting tight, but then you might be descending too soon, to where if you hold it for, you know, 1, 2, you know, hold, whatever that is, 2 counts, 2 holds, and then go, you might be able to notice a difference with that.
Okay. The other guy did say it was a barbell for his front squat.
Okay. So it's bracing or staying tight with the barbell. The reason why I asked is because the mechanics that you deal with, you know, safety squat bar held backwards or a front squat harness it's a lot different. For instance, the front squat harness is jamming into your gut, making it real. It's probably easier to keep your torso tight, because if you don't, it's going to push through and feel like it's going to go out your back from that standpoint. But either way, it's harder to stay tight on any type of front squat, because the shit's like right over your lungs. So it's not like you're going to be able to breathe and pull your sternum up, as a lot of people do when they squat. So you need to keep your ribs you kind of should keep your ribs in a more down position all the time, but it's more pronounced, or it's more important if it's on a front squat. So what you may be trying to do is trying to keep your chest higher than what it really needs to be, which is creating a situation where it's hard for you to get air. It's basically hard for you to breathe. If you don't have oxygen, and it's going to be very hard to be able to get tight. It's kind of one and one. Try to get tight if you're breathing really hard. Try to get tight if somebody punches you in the gut. It's just, you're not, it's going to be really hard to do. So see if that's the issue first, you know, is just the fact that you are doing the front squat and you're pulling your elbows up because you're using a barbell. So a lot of times you're going to be forcing the elbows super, super high. When a lot of people do that, it's also going to force them to arch their lower back more than what they really should, or to lift their sternum more than what they really should, which puts them in a position that makes it harder to be able to get the air. So be a little bit more cognizant on where those are, you know, and make sure they're not over accentuated, you know, and you still need them up. Like, you don't want to drop the bar, right? But it might be over exaggerated, creating a position where you're not able to get your air, thus you're not able to get tight. So try that first.
Okay. Do you want to keep rolling with these?
No, we'll go into the conjugate. Anybody that has conjugate questions, they can ask that. So I'm going to start with, what do you know about conjugate? Basics.
I would like to say I know decent amount. I mean, maximum effort, repetition effort, dynamic effort. You got, if you do it West Side Barbell style, you know, if you want to call it that, because technically concurrent conjugate line gets blurred, then, you know, you got your max effort, upper lower, dynamic effort, upper lower. Use in terms of your repetition stuff on those days. I don't know if this is more of a rule or just a trend of West Side, but you kind of do your more bodybuilding, if you want to call it that, on your dynamic effort day, and then more like main movers, heavier stuff on your max effort day.
All right, let's go max effort method. What do you know about that?
Well, there's, you know, I think it's the traditional definition is the 90% and up, but then you have the goal of straining has kind of been the new definition that's kind of been attributed to it, at least for powerlifting stuff.
Okay, and that's a tricky one because for me, you know, I always see max effort as a single.
Yeah.
Max effort, you know, not max efforts.
Yeah.
Okay, but that goes along the lines of some of the other things that we were talking about. You have to know how people define that.
Sure.
Because many other ones are going to say, well, no, that's just max effort. You know, it's a max effort day. So a lot of people say that their sub-maximal work is maximal work, and that's fine. You know, it's completely fine. You just need to know how they define it, you know, so you can have the conversation with that and you're on the same page. Because there are, you know, sub-maximal things that you can do that I think fall within that day. So if you do, I like time under tension, even though it's just a term, but I like the time under tension because you can strain for X period of time. So say you can do a max effort movement, deficit deadlift, or something that's an exaggerated range of motion, strain your ass off on it and make it last 8 seconds sometime, make it last a long time. That 8 seconds could very well be the same amount of time it might take for somebody to do a high box SS yoke bar triple at a very heavy weight, you know, because the range of motion, or probably more pertinent would be a high board press compared to a cambered bar deficit type of press, you know, which is going to be a greater range of motion from that standpoint. So you can look at that max effort straining and just say, okay, we're just going to look at the time of straining. And that time of straining can be very quickly convoluted based upon the range of motion of the time that it takes. You see what I'm saying? For that range of motion. So those are factors that need to kind of come into play from a programming standpoint, but we'll get to that here in a minute. But I think the key thing to realize is, you know, the conjugate, while it can be max effort, dynamic effort, and, you know, repetition method, those are, you know, 3 ways to increase muscle tension. You know, Louis popularized it, but before that there was Medvedev and Zadorinsky, and, you know, Science of Practice Strength Training. It's in there. It's in the Russian Manual Super Trade. It's in a lot of resources and more, you know, from that standpoint. But those don't necessarily constitute what a conjugate program is. You know, it constitutes what's popular is a conjugate program, and there definitely is a lot of interplay between, you know, West Side method and conjugate method. And, you know, I've said before that conjugate method really could be, you know, trademarked by West Side if Louis really wanted to, but it's been diluted so much that it's better that West Side's kind of set off as just being West Side and conjugates being conjugate, because there's a lot of conjugate stuff that I wouldn't say is anywhere directly related to West Side from that standpoint.
Even in school, when it was a disturbingly low, like, you know, covering of the conjugate method twice over 4 years. But the last time I saw it, like, it was, you know, they call it conjugate or concurrent, but I mean, they use it interchangeably. And it was, you know, it was nothing like a West Side method thing. It was like a, you know, 6-day-a-week thing with Olympic lifts and just random assortment of things.
It can be. I mean, if you want to look at its simplest definition.
Yeah, exactly.
It's coupling, you know. So in a linear method, you have these different phases that are all kind of independent. In a blocket method, you got these phases that are kind of independent, but there might be some stitching, some transition type phases that kind of fall in there. Where in conjugate, you're just kind of taking everything and smushing it together. So you're coupling. Conjugate, the word means coupled.
Yeah.
So you're kind of coupling and putting it all together. Now, from that standpoint, traditionally, when people are going to speak conjugate, they're going to speak those methods of training and how they work within that framework. But from a global view of looking at the macro cycles, mesocycles, microcycles, and all those things still come into play if it's a long-term program. So I still default back to, who you're going to be working with, and what's the longest program you can lay out for that group. Freshmen coming in, D1, D2, 3-4 years, depending, if a very high skilled athlete, 3, but that's 1-2% maybe that are going to be able to go to that next level. So most of them, possibly 4 years. I don't know if I would design a long-term program based upon 2%.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I would base it upon that 4-year period. And if it's a 4-year period, what would be the global, the overreaching objectives after year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and then break those down into those different macro, cycles to be able to put them in there. And from that standpoint, periodization is still periodization, right? Thus why I think everybody should learn the basic linear stuff first, because you learn those big blocks of how things kind of fit together. Then when you start getting into these type of situations, it's like, okay, now I get that. This whole phase is going to focus on X, Y, and Z. This one, 1, 2, 3, whatever it's going to be. But they all have to progressively work to make the athlete better, or become stronger. You don't want to do 6 months of training followed by 6 months of detraining.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense. But if somebody's program hopping and jumping from a 12-week program to a 12-week program to a 12-week program to a 12-week program, that can very well happen without them even knowing that's what they're doing, because they're not taking that overreaching global view of what this is. Or you see how that can very easily happen without them even knowing it's happening. What they call that, when you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
It's kind of
unknown unknowns.
Yes. I mean, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And, it's no fault to the person that's doing the program, because they really don't know, but they should. They should learn to become more aware from that standpoint. But that's why I hate the program hopping that doesn't have any rhyme or reason. Now you can do that, and have rhyme and reason based upon what that overreaching goals are. Then yeah, you could definitely put in, I'm going to do HIIT training for 8 weeks and, West Side for, whatever, and kind of put it all in there. It makes some type of logical sense. If it's just thrown in there, like, well, let's see if this works, and then it doesn't work for the majority, you just had 12 weeks of detraining.
Yeah.
Certainly didn't work, but now what the fuck? So then you stumble across something else, and let's say it works. Well, did it work because it was good, or did it work because you were so detrained almost anything would work? Hell, what you were doing may have actually worked, as you just broke from it and put it in again and implemented it a little differently. So get back to the conjugate now. So with the max effort stuff, that's pretty point on that. If there are constants with that, the one constant I would say is the rest periods. You need to be rested before you do the other, another maximum attempt. I also think that the number of maximum attempts you can do needs to be pretty contained. It's people will point to Pralpin's chart and all these other things. And it's for the most part, it's pretty true. You know, you want to keep it between 2 to 4 maximum attempts. But again, you're falling into, are you talking 90% above, or are you talking actual maximum attempt? So dealing with a broad range of technical attributes, I think what we're dealing with is technical failure, you know, depending upon the exercises, but in most cases, the technical failure is where you're going to draw the line of that's max effort. The technique's so bad that we're not going any higher. Now, is that straining their system maximally? I think it could be debated. You know, I probably would say no, because they're too weak, that it's not. But you can't justify, in my mind, in any way, of the risk of getting somebody hurt because of 1 or 2 sets of an exercise. Where I say it kind of depends is you can take a lot of movements, like a concentric only movement of a pin press. It's pretty hard to get hurt on a pin press. You know, if you're strong, it becomes a little more easier to get hurt because it's a dead press. You can tweak a pec pretty easy. But for the most part, if it's a close grip pin press, it's pretty goddamn hard to get hurt on that. So if the technique gets a little off, it's all right, you know. And if it gets way off, guess what happens? The bar slides back to their head, and they can't press it anyhow. It just slides all over, so they can't do it. So in that case, if the technique gets a little bad, probably not that big of a deal. Technique gets a little bad, let's say if they're doing a good morning and they start windmilling, you know, out of the bottom, probably not a good idea, you know. So common sense can play a little role in there as well. There is always going to be some technical breakdown based upon lifting anything maximally. It's whatever that comfort level is of the coach, you know, in the athlete. More probably so the coach than it is ever going to be the athlete, because they're going to either do nothing or do everything. Yeah. There's not a whole lot of in between. And that's a tough one, you know, because I still deal with that now with lifters that are high level, because for me, it's like, shit, a half inch can be a huge issue, but it might happen in a meet too, you know. So fuck, you know, you got to take that calculated risk, you know, going back on that to be able to know. But if you take the rest period stupidly, you know, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, you're going to negate the benefit of the max effort almost entirely. So let's max effort, done with that. So that's pretty simple. There's tons of articles on that to kind of do a deeper dive. The repetition method, we're going to just keep that really simple, because that can be defined as anything submaximal. So it can be the 3 to 5. I mean, everything that you've read on, here's the strength building rep range, here's the body, you know. For the most part, most of that's pretty solid. There's always exceptions, of course, based upon tempo, and a lot of other factors. But for the most part, that's going to kind of be a catch-all. You know, you're not going to get somebody a whole lot stronger if they're doing 35 reps. You know, endurance-wise, yeah, maybe. But at the same time, if somebody's not conditioned or prepared to do, you know, 3 to 5 rep work sets, that might be a little too soon. It might have to be 5 reps sub-maximal, and just understanding they're not going to be able to push that hard yet. So they're going to have a lot left in the tank. So with the sub-maximal, it becomes more, in my opinion, more of not the actual number that's being lifted, but how many repetitions are left in the tank. So if somebody's doing 5 sets of 5, right, and those 5 sets are done, how many reps could have been done at the end of each one of those sets? So if it's 5 sets of 5 and 3 reps can be left at the end of every set, that's a completely different training stimulus than 5 sets of 5 with 1 rep left at the end of every set. Because 1 rep left of set 1, set 2, set 3 means set 4 and 5, that's going to be fucking hard. Set 5 is going to be really hard. And I can almost say if there's only 1 rep left at the end of every set on 5 sets of 5, that following week it's not going to happen again. So if you take it up even an incremental weight increase, it's probably going to be 5, 5, 5, 4. 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 4 or whatever. But you see my point.
Yeah.
So from that standpoint, some of that needs to be programmed in or communicated. If you don't know, the work ethic may not be the exact word, but if you don't know the lifter's mentality, some lifters are going to always train balls out to failure. So to be able to tell them, look, 2 reps shy, what the fuck you talking about? I don't do that ever. All right. And then some people just don't know because they don't know how to, like, what the fuck do you mean? What's the difference between 2 reps shy or 3? Okay, they don't know. So you got to look at exertion, rep speed, what they look like afterwards. Every now and again, throw in a 6 set for an AMRAP, which I'm not a huge fan of, but throw it in, see what happens. You know, if they're doing 5 sets of 5 and then you have them do a 6 set and they do 35 reps, more than likely the 5 sets of 5 was done at a very low intensity. You know, so in the coach's mind, at least, you should kind of know what's left in the tank from that standpoint. And in my opinion, if you're dealing with 3s, 5s, reps that would fall in that strength, power type range, there shouldn't be a whole lot left in the tank. Usually no more than 1, 2, 3, unless it's very, very front end of the training session. But then I would wonder, why is it not 8s? You know, why is it not something else? When you're dealing with the 8 to 10, you know, a lot of times those can be pushed to 2 to 3 reps shy of failure, but that's really hard to gauge because you can take somebody that's doing sets of 8 to 10, get in their face, and they can always do a rep more than you thought or they thought. So there's always that 10% more that's there that a coach can typically always, you know, milk out of an athlete, but is it necessary? That's kind of another question. But when you get to the 15 reps, that's kind of another thing too. It's really hard to fail at 15. You can't, normal failure. You know, I'll talk about different failure in a minute. But a coach can get in their face and they can probably do 5 more. You see 10% more, typically what it can be. But when you're dealing with reps in that range, you're going to start dealing with oxygen debt, which is going to create the failure more so than the muscular failure. But again, each one of those should be how many reps are left, because that's going to determine the training stimulus more than the actual reps. Kind of get that?
Yeah.
That's repetition method simplified from that standpoint. Now, the more trained that person is with that repetition method, the better the easier and better it is to train them. Because if you start moving through a training day, which will be another discussion, you know, more than likely you're going to go from the hardest, you know, intensity load to the lightest. When you get down to the lightest, in my opinion, from a training economy standpoint, the lightest you can make that, the better it is, or the lighter you can make it, the better it is. So you can start manipulating tempo, you can start manipulating a lot of things to where, it could be very easy, not easy, but there could be the potential for somebody to do 80-pound dumbbell side raises and just sling the fucking things up. And form not be bad. It would be loose, but not that bad. To me. I mean, other people may say it's bad, but, you know, if it depends upon how the repetitions perform and so forth. But I don't see, for a strength athlete, when it's a bottom end movement like that, I don't see the need for that, because it's not put in there to make a stronger side raise. If it's that low in a training, it's put in there for muscle hypertrophy of the shoulders. So in my opinion, let's take it down. Like, how can we use 30, 35, 40 pounds and get more out of it? So the more trained the athlete is, I can tell them, you know, I want you to use 30-pound, 35-pound dumbbells and fail at 12 reps. And once they get to 8, if they're like, it's easy, they're going to slow it down. They're going to try to pause at the top. You know, they're going to manipulate that tempo within the set, so that last rep, they're going to heave it up there to be able to get it, but failed when I wanted them to fail. Probably could even do it with 15 pounds, but it may be a slow ass set, but it can be done. It can be done with a fucking 2.5 pound plate.
Yeah. If
you go slow enough and you use the right intensification principles, most definitely, you know, they can fail with just manual resistance from that standpoint. So that's the variance that we're dealing with with the repetition method. The way you'll typically see it defined is training to failure. Well, that can be defined a lot of different ways. What type of failure?
Yeah.
Because there's to failure, past failure, and so forth. Done. Repetition method. Dynamic effort. That's where things can be very complicated, very fast, because from a programming standpoint, the max effort stuff, yes, there are some variables to program, which we'll discuss, and even the repetition, there's a lot of variables to program there, but nothing like the dynamic effort. The dynamic effort, in my opinion, from what we call that traditional conjugate, is that's where your whole phase, that's where the waves come in, because you don't necessarily have waves with max effort work, though you can, but they're not going to be as pronounced. And pronounced is probably not a good word. Promoted is probably not a good word. Visual, I guess, from an internet perspective, you're always going to be able to find, do this dynamic phase, do this dynamic, do this everywhere. You're not going to find, do this repetition method phase, or do this max effort. You're not going to see that. This is what's most pronounced. This is what's most confusing for people. I already went on, how to determine a real basic 3-week phase. I'm a proponent of a 3-week phase. Totally got that from Louis. When I came to Westside, it was 5 weeks. After leaving Westside, I've played with 4 weeks. I played with 5 weeks. I do use a 6-week. I'm not going to complain. There are other phases that I will use, but 80% of the time it's a 3-week phase. It's just easy, to be able to dial in what those intensity ranges are going to be for somebody, percents, however you want to put it, and to manipulate them and to see what's going on. And I like to stitch those dynamic phases together. So I don't look at a dynamic phase as just, here's this 3-week phase. It's what's this 3-week phase going to bring to the next one, and where's it leading, right? So where's it all going? So if there's a meet, using a power lift, there's a meet, obviously it's going to lead to that meet, but that meet's still going to be a stepping stone to where it's going to lead to future meets or whatever it's going to be. So just to use, something that's easier to see is that meet, at 7 3-week phase, 21 weeks out from the meet, do I really need to be worrying about peaking for that? What are the concerns that need to be developed at 21 weeks out? Typically conditioning, form, technique, stuff like that. So that 3-week phase, falling back kind of on what you learned about block, right? It's going to be more technically oriented, or conditioning, whatever you want to say. I like technical, because the higher the sets, the more opportunities there are to practice a first rep. So now I'm speaking powerlifting, strength sports, strongman, stuff like that. A lot of times, if it's a single, obviously, and that's powerlifting, strongman's different. Olympic weightlifting's a single. You need to be proficient at doing 1 rep. When fatigue sets in, that, as I said before in that other conversation, to be able to display technique with fatigue is a different skill set than it is to display it without fatigue. So that skill set becomes developed the more advanced the lifter becomes, which isn't usually the lifter you're going to be working with, right? And you can't spend all your time developing that. So you have to develop the technique in the most efficient way you can develop it, which is going to be in a non-fatigue state, which is usually the first rep. So the first rep of a 5-rep set is going to look way different than the 5th. So if you're trying to reinforce technique on somebody, you can do 15 to 20 reps. There's 15 to 20 first reps. So 15 to 20 opportunities to perfect the best technique you possibly can. Compared to 3 sets of 3, you have 3 opportunities to perfect that technique. So over a month, you could be looking at 12 to 80. That's, you keep compounding that out over a period of a month. As I talked about in one of the earlier conversations that we had, if you're focusing just on technique over a 4-month period of time, and those phases are going 15, 18, 20 sets. So you're looking at, maybe even higher, 25 sometimes. So if you're looking at an average of 70, first reps per month, 4 months, you got 280. And I can pretty much say the fatigue isn't even going to play a role at that percentage in 2 reps. So you're looking at 560 compared to most traditional training programs. It's going to take 3 years to accomplish that same level of technical proficiency that you're going to get there. You see, I'm going back to how the skill is developed in an athlete. This is where my bias gets formed, right? Because it's like, okay, you can use a broomstick, and that definitely has its place and it definitely helps. But can you develop that skill with speed with a broomstick? Maybe, if they're weak as fuck, because there's nothing there. It's too light. It falls in that area that I talked about that's kind of not dynamic, but we're talking dynamic, not plyometric.
Yeah.
So it's different. And so it's that a lot of times what I'm getting at, a lot of times the dynamic effort isn't so much about developing that dynamic strength or, manipulating the force velocity curve and a lot of other things that people will say to try to make it technical. And yes, that's a role. That's one of the goals behind that. But a bigger goal, in my opinion, is that technical skill set, technical mastery behind all that. Because that's typically what's going to get the athlete stronger, faster. And I paused because when I say athlete, in my head, that's not just a power lifter.
Yeah.
It always kind of, football's where I have most of my experience talking to coaches. It always flips back. Like, okay, well, does this apply then to the Colts coming back? Does this apply then to the football player? Don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know. That's a whole other conversation, but it's one that needs to be had if you're a strength coach, because is it worth that 25 to 30 sets to develop mastery in one movement? It depends. How important is that movement to your program? But I don't want to get off track. From the dynamic set, you're looking at those waves. And if you can build those waves into the program and they chain, kind of daisy chain off each other to where you want that objective to be, then you can either work back, which is what most people do, work back, from the objective. But the trick with that is when you're thinking 3-4 years out, you're not going to work back week for 4 years.
Yeah.
You could, right? But I would argue that that's an immense waste of time, because I can almost guarantee by the time you get to year 3, what you're going to do compared to what you thought you were going to do are going to be vastly different. But you can think and develop mental blocks for that period of time. So here, for those 6 months, this is how it's going to progress over that quadrennial period. That should be done. And then once that's done, you have these defined but very open blocks towards the 3 years or 2 years or whatever it is. And then you start almost micromanaging, the blocks 2 years out. And then it gets a little more micromanaged 1 year out, and extremely micromanaged 6 months out, and insanely micromanaged, 4 months out, and then completely detailed from that standpoint going forward. Where my argument would be, not argument, but philosophy, I guess, is if you kind of know the dynamic layout, that provides more structure for a coach to be able to think, here's where it's going to be long term. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because it has more structure because of all that. That's where, without getting lost in the minute minute details of dynamic work, you can see how, from a conjugate perspective, that's, in my opinion, that's the leader, right? From a pro, you get that down first, and then everything kind of fills in the blank from there, because that really isn't going to change a whole lot based upon strengths or weak points, or weak skill sets, right? That's pretty much going to stay pretty solid, where everything else is going to change based upon skill level, skill set, weak point, all this other stuff's going to, from a conjugate perspective, is going to be hit, and all those other things, not so much the max effort work, but the stuff from there. So dynamic is kind of like the checkbox first, and then what max effort work would be number 2, and then the supplemental, which I define differently, just in my own head. I define supplemental different than accessory. That would be the third. Then accessories are, okay, what can we put in as icing on the cake that's necessary, but maybe not always be necessary, because if something's going to have to get pulled out due to potential overtraining, overreaching, or something like that, it's usually going to be that, because you can pull that pretty quick and not have to change anything else. And that's not to say that you won't have to change the other things, but if you have to change the other things, it's usually because you should have pulled those or changed the accessories and supplemental stuff before, and because you didn't, now you have to change the bigger things. So that's an overview, a gross overview of how those things kind of fall into place. Where are we at on time?
We're about hour and a half in.
All right, we'll go a little bit. Are there any questions that people had about any of this?
I see one. This guy said, bridging the previous episode, what should conjugate trainers learn from block and linear models? What can linear block style trainees steal from conjugate?
Sorry, dude, I can't be. Did you not listen to what the fuck I just said? Sorry, I'm not trying to bust the guy's balls to be a complete asshole, but I will restate, because he could have just chimed in, or I wasn't clear on what I was saying. What you can learn and why you should. Let me kind of restate that, because maybe that's how I stated it before and it was misinterpreted. So, and how I was trying to state it. But what you should learn from those two types of periodization is, they are more similar than what people make them out to be. Actually, all types of periodization is more similar than people make them out to be. They try to differentiate, what's the word I can't say, but they try to do that to make what they're saying seem better. I mean, there's a whole sales aspect behind all this crap, and there's a positioning aspect behind all this crap as well from that standpoint. And unfortunately, there's less of an educational aspect than there is, the positional sales aspect of a lot of these things. But they are more similar than people think. But the things that I think that you need to take away from those is just the global viewpoint of, long-term planning cycles. So a mesocycle, macrocycle, microcycle, stuff like that. You don't even need to use those words. I hate using those words, to be honest with you. I can't stand them. So say, multi-year programming, which I'd say quadrennial a lot of times, but basically multi-year programming. You can think of year programming and then break it down into more, quarter programming or month programming. Those global aspects are going to be common amongst everything. When you're dealing with the other periodization models, a linear model, for example, the bulk of the training program is going to be separated based upon phase. So you'll have a conditioning phase, hypertrophy phase, whatever it's going to be called. Everybody's got, not everybody, but people have different names for each one of these phases. So again, that's another aspect that confuses a lot of people. There can be a strength phase a power phase and a peak phase, where the power phase is really kind of weird because the definition of power doesn't equate to what they're actually doing in that phase, which it is what it is. So let's make it easier. You got like an 8 to 10 rep phase with lighter weights, a phase that's going to fall in like a 5 rep phase, then a 3 rep phase, and then a single phase. And there's not a lot of unity, you know, amongst those phases. So what you're going to see in that conditioning phase, you're probably not going to see in the single rep phase. When you're dealing with blocks, it's kind of the same thing is what that is, but there's more phases and there's transitional blocks to kind of tie those phases together. When you're dealing with a conjugate, you're kind of just taking all those blocks and smashing them together and doing everything at the same time in the most efficient way that you can do, which means in a lot of cases you're losing a lot of attributes because you can't train everything is going to be trained in all those block phases in one period of time. You just don't have enough hours in the day. So it's a little bit easier to understand sport development with block, because a lot of people will think of conjugate training and all they think of is the weight room work. So strength and conditioning with barbells and shit like that. But when you're dealing with athletes, you're dealing with a lot more than that. You're dealing with, you know, technical work, you're dealing with field work, you're dealing with a lot of aspects outside of just absolute or maximal strength. You know, you have flexibility, you have endurance, you have skill, you have all these other attributes that have to be put in there. And sometimes those are managed easier with a block type setting because there may be certain periods of time, i.e. blocks, that are going to focus more on the skill development of that specific sport. You know, i.e. 2-a-days for a football player, things of that. So you can't take a football player that's doing 2-a-days or very heavy skill development with heavy conditioning type of work and expect them to be able to produce peak maximum force. It's just not gonna happen. That's asking the body to do more than it's capable of doing. So that's where the block makes it a little easier to define how the overall training program is structured. As long as you know what those overreaching goals of each training phase are, that doesn't mean you can't use conjugate to train a football player. That's quite opposite what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you can't train a football player using conjugate and only do weight room work. It doesn't work that way because they still have to practice and do the plays. You know, that's still an energy that's being exerted when they go out on the practice field and practice. You can debate that they shouldn't have to do any running or any SPP work from a strength standpoint. We can have that conversation. I get that. But you can't tell me that they should not go on the field and practice their plays, you know, and practice their sport. You can't do that. Show me a team that's strong as fuck and has never practiced and just goes on the field and plays games once a week, and I'll show you what their record is. They're gonna fucking suck, you know. But I can show you the opposite. Show me the team that does very little work, you know, as far as strength and conditioning, which doesn't really exist anymore. But they'll still win some games, maybe, but they should. That's it with that.
Yeah, that was it, conjugate question-wise.
Okay, so we'll go back to the conjugate stuff. And using what we discussed, just the global definition. So let's stay with dynamic work. Dynamic or max effort, I don't care. What questions would you have about those?
Well, you touched on the time under tension thing for max effort, but you also said a brief thing about singles, but like how do you think like 3s and 5s fit in? You know, does that never fit in max effort for you? I know it's technically not max effort, but
I wouldn't say for me it never fits in. I will say I'm not a fan of it, but I'm not going to not do it just because I'm not a fan of it. So there's certain times where I like it with good mornings, and that's because I don't like good mornings that are heavy singles. And I did heavy singles for years and years and years, and I think they have a benefit. But I think there's more benefit of the triples with that than the singles. And I can't really tell you why. I could sit there and say, there's a greater risk of getting hurt with the singles than triples, but I don't necessarily believe that to be true. So I'm not going to say that. Just my experience in that alone has shown that people generally get better results and carryovers out of the triples on that than they would a single. Other things of that nature are usually a Zercher squat would be a good example, or any variation of a Zercher squat. More so from the standpoint of they can't hold the bar, for the singles. So if they can't hold it because it hurts too bad or it's way too uncomfortable, then the triples are a good, next option. Front squats for a lot of people will fall in that same realm as well, depending upon how they do it. If it's a harness, maybe not so much because it's pushing in and they can't breathe. From a submaximal standpoint, it can have its place as long as you're factoring the workload as well as the time, but I think it's more movement wise. So like a 4-board press is probably going to be better because it's such a short movement with more than one rep, but not always. Depends on what the weakness. If it's somebody's lockout sucks and that one rep's going to take a long time, then that might be better than doing the triple. But for most, nothing's ever absolute, which confuses me a lot of times. But for most, it's going to be like a triple. Even pin pulls, to the higher the pin pull goes, it's usually going to have to be more than one rep because of that. I don't know if it's time under tension, but maybe, I may better be defined as work, because that would be weight times distance.
Yeah.
So if I don't want to confuse people too much, but if you look at the work, that might be a better way to look at it than time under tension and reps.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Well, because it's not the traditional time under tension.
Yeah,
but it's
that can
it's
be
similar.
manipulated. I mean, it can be manipulated, and I think if anything, if you can listen and understand that, every principle, you say it's time under tension, every principle can be manipulated to the point that it becomes non-effective, okay, or manipulated to the point that it becomes too high risk. So time under tension, fuck it, let's just load it so fucking much that they have to strain their balls off no matter what they have to do to be able to get from point A to point B. All right, a dead squat from a bottom position with a safety squat bar. So get underneath there when you're completely condensed and you can't breathe, and stand up. There's going to be a lot of time under tension with the strain, but I'm not sure any point of that lift is going to even resemble a lift outside of standing up from a bad start position with the safety squat bar. Using the same movement, let's take it to a very high pin to where the bar actually doesn't even move that much after the pad compresses. They may have to push in it for 5 or 6 seconds before it actually breaks the pin, then it breaks the pin. So the question would be, how effective are either one of those two compared to how effective is everything that could happen in between those two? You see what I'm saying? So the furthest end on each side is usually always going to be non-optimal, where what's in that middle area is going to be the most optimal.
This was kind of the tail end of the dynamic effort YouTube question, but I've seen it before. I know Burley Hawk has like a popular West Side for Raw like series online where he does this, where you take out dynamic effort sometimes and you sub in like max 8s and stuff like that, where it's the repetition method.
Mm-hmm. What was that for dynamic, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. It's just subbing out. Basically, what you're trying to do is how can you put in the repetition method, which I'm not going to sit here and tell somebody it does not work to make somebody stronger. It does, so essentially how can you take a section of Western method periodization or linear periodization, extract that from linear periodization and stick it into a conjugate model to where it's still going to be the most effective. So if you were to take it out of there and strip it in as accessory work or supplemental work, how effective would it be? Well, I don't know, because it's going to be very dependent upon what you did before that. So you're either going to do max effort work or dynamic work before that, which is going to right away limit the effectiveness of what that is, because it's a core lift based upon fatigue, going into that. So I think everybody would agree it's not going to be as effective than if it was placed first in the training.
That's what it is.
Yeah. So if it's placed first in the training, where would it best be placed? Max effort or dynamic? I'm just explaining some of the thought process that may have went into why this is being put in there. All right, well, if we put it in as max effort work, that means you're going to be squatting, Monday, Friday, or Tuesday, Friday, however it's laid out, every week. So it's a hell of a lot of squatting, with sub-maximal weights, dynamic max effort, for 3 weeks. Is that optimal? It can definitely work. But to do that to somebody that's not conditioned to squatting twice a week, it's probably going to lead to overreaching, because they're going from squatting once a week for a long period of time to boom, not just twice a week, but twice a week at a fairly high intensity. So that's not going to be optimal. Now, if we took the dynamic workout and put that there, is that a better fit? You see how the logic goes into this? Well, yeah, that would be a better fit. What's the worst thing that could happen? Well, over a 3-week period of time, maybe they lose some explosive force capabilities. Is that really going to happen over 3 weeks?
Yeah.
For most people, probably not. Maybe over 6, 8, 10, possibly, but 3, probably not. So what's the worst thing that can happen? They just don't get better. They stay the same. Well, what's the best? They get better.
Yeah.
So that's a fair trade. You see?
Yeah. Risk reward.
Yeah. So it kind of falls into there. So that's why I say to do something like that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
The only, from my own bias, the only negative that would be in there is you're going to lose some first reps, from that standpoint. So if you're going to lose the first reps from that skill development standpoint, what are you going to gain in exchange for that? Because that's not necessarily always a bad thing. So if you're going to not have that, what are you going to gain? Well, now you're dealing with, a sub-maximal range at a higher rep, which is going to create more hypertrophy, strength development, the bigger muscle, stronger muscle. So it's worth the trade, so that's why it's there. Now, if it's being put in is supplemental work, or then I don't know. The other place you'll see that put in sometimes is you may see a week layout that spans over 8-10 days, and you'll see dynamic work, max effort work, sub-maximal work. Dynamic work, max effort, sub-maximal. So it's, instead of having that 7-day training cycle, they just added, a day of rest, maybe 2, and then another day, which will be that, or the sub-maximal, and maybe even another day or 2, and then another sub-maximal day for the other lifts, and then going back to it again and rotating through. That's another way it could be in there that makes sense, from a long-term programming standpoint.
So you've got these beginners, the people saying, dynamic effort doesn't work for beginners, and you talk about the first rep being key. Do you think there's something people can do if they aren't in the group training environment that you would recommend, they need to run through their checklist every single time for the first rep?
I mean, they're going to have to, because depending upon their skill level, making a checklist and posting it on the freaking wall.
Yeah.
Or in their headphones, recording something that's going to tell them what they should do in a certain period of time. Obviously technique's way better than it was 5, 10, 20 years ago. So there's a lot of things that you can do now that can kind of help with that. And like I said before, you can interchange, in my mind, dynamic work with technical work. It's the same thing, so when I hear things like, well, dynamic work really isn't good for people who are beginners, what I'm hearing is technical work isn't really good for people who are beginners. And I go, oh, fuck, I don't believe in that. Because, there's another factor with technical work that comes into play too, is, you can say, well, I'm just going to have the beginner do 3 sets of 10. That's going to be 30 technical reps because the weight's not going to be that heavy. They're going to get bored. Maybe they're going to pay attention for the first two reps, maybe 3. And they're going to check the fuck out. And if you don't know that to be true, you've never worked with a teenager, you never worked with an athlete that doesn't give a fuck about what they do in the weight room, I would even say you've never worked with lifters that haven't been doing this for a long period of time. Because it's hard, to keep your focus on technique if you haven't been doing this for a long time, for very long, especially today's world. I'm not just saying this as, a grumpy Gen Xer, it's, they were saying this shit about me when I was coming up. I was a lazy fuck too, just like everybody today is a lazy fuck. It's the same thing, but it's just the attention span. That's a factor too. You can't just assume that's going to be there. It should be there, hopefully, with the 1 rep. I would hope to God it's there for 1 rep. If you're not a good enough coach to get the attention span for 1 rep, then you might want to check and see if there's a different profession that you can do, because it's not that. But I would say with each rep after the first one, it drops significantly. And this just isn't squat, bench, and deadlift. It would be a drop step in wrestling. It would be any skill that you're going to have somebody perform. After a period of repetitions, they need a break just to reset their mind and to start again. You just can't do hundreds of reps over and over and over again without a break.
For when you start coming into, like, this is a total different direction, when you start coming into like a peak with extra workouts, the stuff that's less specific to your comp, are you pulling those out at all?
That's a tricky one.
Yeah, because I've seen people approach deloads different ways. I've seen people do like basically just extra workouts the entire deload, if they do the hard week or whatever type of deload. But I've also seen people that are like, why do anything that isn't what I'm about to do?
It depends upon what the extra workout's there for. Some people are doing it, and I think this is a mistake. Some people are doing it just because they love to train. Okay, that's the wrong reason to do it. Those people love to train more than they love results. All right, and there's a lot of people that fall in that category, and that's fine as long as they understand that. Because the extra workout should be put in there when needed, to be able to move the athlete forward, and if it's not needed, then in my opinion, it shouldn't be there, because there's a point of diminishing returns. If how many extra workouts are you going to be able to do over a 7-day period of time? Once you maximize those, where are you going to go?
Yeah.
You're not, you're not. So if the extra workouts can be programmed for a lot of reasons. You can have feeder workouts, to be able to get you prepared for whatever you're going to do. I'll use very loose examples. If you're going to bench that day, you're going to do some kind of overhead pressing. Your triceps are still feeling it from the last time. You can grab a band and do shit ton of band push downs just to get blood in there. There's really not a lot of eccentric tension because it's a band. You just kind of let it go back up, push it out. You're not going to do anything that's going to take away your strength, that's going to put blood in there, going to help prepare you more for that training session, assuming that you needed that. Okay. And so that would be what I would call a feeder workout. Then there's recovery workouts, which you do max effort, you squat or whatever you did on day one, and you wake up the next day and you feel like you got hit by a truck. I'm not talking about your basic DOMS, muscle soreness and stuff like that's different. That should kind of be expected for a period of time. The more conditioned you get, the harder it is to be able to achieve that. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's great if you can do a hard, strenuous training session and never get muscular soreness from it. To me, it means you're recovering at a rapidly fast rate. That's good. You don't pound your ass to where you have to make yourself that way. But you wake up, you feel like you got hit by a different feeling. You're just like, oh fuck, almost like you're starting to get the flu, but you're not. That is when you would need that extra training session to be able to get blood, get your body working, get it moving, kind of work the kinks out. That's an easy way to say that. But if it's not needed, it shouldn't be forced, because your body will adapt to recovery modalities the same way it will adapt to strength modalities. And when your body adapts to the recovery modalities, what's next? More recovery modalities. And then you run out of modalities is what I'm saying. And the whole point of peaking is to be able to get there the most efficient way that you can. And if you end up having to leave cards in the deck, great. That's better than not having any more cards left to play. Then it's like, fuck, you don't know where to go from there. So there's feeder workouts, there's the recovery workouts, and there's special exercise where our extra workouts that's what I call the extra workout. Yeah. Extra workouts are to bring up lagging body parts, to bring up technical flaws, stuff like that. Those, right, that are being put in there, typically you'll see sometimes for upper back, because they can take quite a lot of work that otherwise may not be able to be fit into the program. It just gets skipped too much. Torso work may be one. Strongman competitors, technical work. It's still going to be loaded, but it's not going to be loaded enough to really be training, but you still need to know how to step, on a farmer's walk or a yoke carry and stuff like that. You have to find the stride length that works for you. And if all you're ever doing is trying to figure that out under maximum loaded conditions, all the best to you. Yeah. Because you're going to be the guy that's going to go compete. Somebody's like, dude, come here, man. Maybe you want to take shorter. You're like, oh, fuck, I never thought of that. Then you break your PR by 40%. You're like, what the fuck? You should figure that all out. Those are the ones you don't want to take out, right? Because they're helping you to maintain and to reinforce whatever that technique is or that weak point that you need to be able to compete at the top of your game. You can pull it out 3 or 4 days, it's within reason, what I'm saying? You can pull it out 3 or 4 days, but usually there's going to be a taper. And I think that's what you're talking about for, a peak. But that taper is also dependent upon what's leading to that taper. You got to have something to taper off from, and that becomes kind of the infamous 4 weeks out. We're like, oh my God, 4 weeks out, everybody's like, I don't know if I can fucking do this. I can't, I feel like shit. I'm weak. Everything hurts. I can't get out. It's like, perfect. You're right where you need to be. Just shut up and let's talk 2 weeks from now. And like, a week out, like, damn, I'm tired, but it's okay. Then it's like at the meet, it's like a whole nother person. But you can't lose the skill. Skill is something that drops fast. Strength can be maintained, speed can be maintained, and peak. You can't take skill and deload it because it's gonna go to shit. It's terrible. Okay. That's
it. That's all I got.
Okay. From that standpoint, the max effort dynamic, there's cycles and so forth we can talk about more next time around. The repetition method is where there's a lot of things that can be built in there. And so for accessories and supplemental stuff, where it doesn't always have to be blindly put in there, which I think is what most people do. You can put microstructures or micro-periodization into a training plan, which, how can I explain this? some of the people that train out here right now, I have them, they don't know this, but they're doing it. I have them doing kind of like an embedded micro plan for the dumbbell presses, for their pressing movements. It's in the program where, let's say I just wanted to use flat dumbbell presses and keep it in the program for 6 weeks and program it. How am I going to be able to progress somebody that's intermediate to advanced lifter and make progress over 6 weeks in a dumbbell press? Even if you back it off and say, well, their best is 100 pounds for 6 and we're going to start at 70 pounds. They're going to get to 100 pounds pretty quick. And then what are you left with? 105, 110? I mean, how much stronger are they really going to get over that 100 in one training phase? You don't have a lot of micro load. I guess you could if you had the little magnet things. But fatigue still plays a role too, because the dumbbells, you're not going to have 3s. And normally you're not even going to have 5s, or you're certainly not going to, some will have singles, but you're not going to have singles, 3s. It just doesn't fall in line with dumbbells. So one thing that, well, I'll just tell you what I'm doing. So I have flat presses and incline presses done at a normal flat and a normal incline. And then I change the sequence the next week. So it goes incline to flat. So now obviously they're weaker on one than the other and stronger on one than the other. And then I'll take it back and go flat, flip the sequence again. And they should have progression from one over the other. Then I'll flip it again and they should have progression. Now that's about where it's going to not be able to progress anymore. From that standpoint, we're going to mechanically change it to where they can keep progressing. So the incline is going to drop down one. So they should be stronger because they're going from a higher incline to a lower. So they're going to be able to still progress up. On the flat bench, they're going to go to slipping a plate under the front end. So it's going to be, they don't know this, they do now, but it's going to be a slight decline, so they're going to be able to keep progressing. So while I was able to manipulate the progression for as long as I can still manipulate it from a mechanical progression. So I progressed first based upon sequence, progressed second based upon the mechanical progression, and then by that time the peak should be there. So I was able to run the same 2 exercises over a period of 6 weeks, which you normally can't do, right? Yeah. Most people just blindly switch it. I like to keep things in there for longer periods of time to be able to have that progression for the adaptation to be able to take place from the physical standpoint, but it's also from the mental standpoint. They're going to say, hey, when I started this, I was using X dumbbell. Now I'm using, Z dumbbell, which it can be a completely different exercise, but still, see what I'm saying? So it's not just throwing shit against the wall saying we're going to dumbbell press this week and next week we're going to do the machine presses, next week so we're going to do this press. Where will that line up in a linear progression fashion from either work, volume, or, another thing I got in there is the band push downs, which I believe started at 60 or 70 reps. This week it's 120. So that's just going to keep scaling up. That won't go up forever. At a certain point it's going to come back down to either a different exercise or 60. So just because it's repetition method or an accessory method doesn't mean there's not progression associated with it. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Where most will say, well, you can get a few weeks, then fuck it, I'll just change the exercise. Sometimes you can milk a little bit more out of that, especially if it's something that's focusing on a weak point that needs to be developed. And there's different examples, there's tons of things like that, which we can go over during a different session. But for now, it's just understanding that the dynamic, typically 3 to 5 week waves, make it easy. The max effort, I think it should change every week. Coaches will disagree. Some will like 3 week waves. And sometimes you need an athlete to get used to the movement. And that's more coordination thing. If it's a close grip incline, they just don't know how to do it. So they need a week to kind of get how to do it. And then the next week and that's fine. If it's an athlete, that's fine. If it's a strength athlete, I still don't like it. I think they can kind of figure it out that day. And there's enough variations to be able to move from that, because as stated before, you can't train at 90% and above all the time, but you can if you're changing the movement, because by changing the movement, you can change the workload, because you'll be stronger at some things and weaker at others. The load's going to be way higher, just talking weight, on a high board press than it would be cambered bar bench press. Sometimes 40% difference, huge difference. That lower end of the range, on the other end of it could be a low box, safety squat, closed stance. On that low end of the range, that bottom weight with that single, a lot of times is going to be 20 to 30% lighter than what they would have used for some type of submaximal loading exercise in replace of that, which contradicts the argument of, well, max effort work's always dangerous. Well, is it if the load is 30% less than what the alternative is for more reps? Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? So it's every argument has a counter argument. So that's just kind of how it goes. You have anything, Josh?
On those topics, or just the random YouTube
Just
questions?
anything at this point.
Yeah, there's a bunch of random ones here. Most recent one was how to minimize neck pain on good mornings, and how high should the bar be?
Obviously, you have it too high. So that would be my answer there. I'm not seeing it, so it's hard to say if you don't see it. First thing is, no exercise should you ever have pain that's not what you would consider good pain for the movement. And I would even say you really even shouldn't have good pain. So if you have neck pain doing a good morning, either don't do the good morning. That would be my first thing. Or figure out, if my guess is you're probably carrying it way too high. Bring it down a little bit lower. Maybe try some different variation of the good morning, but you shouldn't have pain, on any movement.
Okay. This guy said, what's the difference between 45 and 90 degree back and hyperextension machine, and how to do hyperextensions correctly? What muscles should I squeeze, lower back or glutes and or hamstrings? And then sets and reps, but obviously you don't know what his goals are for sets and reps.
What's the difference is the angle. I mean, that's kind of the obvious difference, but 45 degree and a 90 degree is basic. I mean, so there's other obvious things, and that is, what does your gym have? What do you have access to? So if you have both, then we can have the conversation of, how can you use both? The force on the spine is going to be higher at the 90 degrees. Just picture it, right? You're in a 90 degree back raise. Picture the person at the top at that 90 degrees. Where is the force being applied to the spine? Think about it. It's more force is going to be applied right to the lower back of the spine. Now you go at the 90 degrees more, where's the force going to be? Gravity. Think about that as far as the force where it's going to be applied. So it's different. I wouldn't say one is necessarily safer than the other. They're different. So if you have pain doing one as opposed to not having pain doing the other, do the one that you don't have the pain. I think there's value to both. I just leave it at that.
Okay. You may have touched on this earlier, but how to continue developing strength as a young athlete with no off season? I don't think you did.
What sport has no off season? I'm a little confused.
I would imagine, my guess is that he's doing multiple sports.
Oh, I got it. Don't worry about it, dude. If you're a young athlete, you're doing multiple sports, just keep fucking doing what you're doing. Don't worry about, I hate to say this, but don't worry about, getting to the weight room. Don't worry about the training. If you're in one season to another season to another season, as an athlete, that's far better for you than spending all your time in the weight room. I would like to see, a mixture of the both, because I'm a meathead and that's my background. But the reality of the situation is being a multi-sport athlete is far fucking better than being a single sport athlete that's in the weight room all the time. So just keep doing what you're doing. Keep not having an off season. That's the goal. What sport can you be involved in all the time, all year round, until you're a junior or senior, if even that, until you graduate.
Okay. What are your thoughts on the chair sumo deadlift to learn the sumo deadlift, and how should the proper setup look like, chair height, etc., and what's the right technique and what should I focus on?
Chair height's hard to say because I don't know the distance between your knee and your ankle. So, I like it. I like the chair. I like the chair deadlift. I do. You want to have, if you can set it up, you want to have your hips being very close to the same position, maybe a little bit lower than where they're going to be at the start of the deadlift. If it's way lower than where it's going to be at the start of the deadlift, first off, I don't think you're going to be able to do it. You're not going to be able to do it effectively. You're not going to be able to do it right. But the mistake is a lot of people will just, here's a chair, here's a box, I'm going to take that, I'm going to sit on it, and that's what I'm going to use. And it's not conducive to where their start position would be. So find the start position that's the same as what you pull from, and then go from there.
Okay. What do you recommend for a herniated back? I'm trying to come back from a herniated L4 and L5, causing some sciatica. Also, when will Elite FTS squat box be at the Elite FTS UK store?
I thought the squat box was at the store, but I could be wrong. I don't know the answer to that, but I thought it was.
I'm looking right now.
I think the squat box and the plyo box is. If it's not, it could be sold out. I don't know. With that one, I don't know. I'll have to look into the. What was the other question? What was the more?
What do you recommend for herniated back? And it was an L4, L5.
I can't, because I'm not qualified to recommend that. I'm not a physical therapist or a doctor, so I can't tell you. I've never herniated any disc in my back beyond just a strain, so I can't tell you from my own experience what I did either. So can't help you with that one.
We do have the squat box on there.
I thought so. Yep.
Maybe it's sold out. I don't know. On the site. Okay. So this guy said went from on toes bench to flat feet. I'm just reading this as it's stated. So went from on toes bench to flat feet. Elbows are now going too low, equal or a little bit lower than the pad. What do you suggest to get the elbows higher? Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I don't know if one caused the other, but I'm assuming it did because you mentioned it. It doesn't have to. So whatever you did with your feet has disrupted how you were setting up your upper back. So go back to setting your upper back and your shoulders on the bench the way that you were when that wasn't happening, and then change your foot position. I'm going to guess that you're setting your feet before your back, which you shouldn't do, but I'm going to guess that because I don't see how vice versa would create the causation that you're speaking about. So that's what I would say.
Okay. I'm looking. That might be it. I don't know if this is really your realm, but it said, how effective would dynamic effort be for the Olympic lifts?
It's kind of where it started. Very, very effective. I regress. I've never trained anybody with the Olympic lifts, and I don't know how to do the Olympic lifts. So I'm kind of speaking out my ass here, but where all this stems from, at least from my knowledge and my reading, it all came from Olympic weightlifting. So I would assume, since that's where it all came from, it would apply very well to that. So that's where I would go with that. I can't speak that detailed about something that I've never done.
Okay. Here's a good one to end on. It kind of takes it back to the previous question of a young athlete. This guy said, should in-season athletes prioritize heavy compound exercises or accessory exercises more? It doesn't say what sport, but
there's a lot of variables there. If you don't start, it doesn't matter what you do. You should train hard. Your recovery is going to be a factor in all of this. Whatever you can recover from is what you want to do. So if you can recover from what you're wanting to try to put in there, by all means, put it in there if it's going to help you. If you can't recover from it, then I'm going to guess it's not going to help you. So you can't not be a good athlete at the expense of wanting to train differently. That's not the reason why you're training, especially in season. With my own experience, in season type of training, it was more a matter of timing when I trained that had a greater impact than how I trained. So with the sports I participated in, there are always walkthrough days that I could train a little bit harder on. A lot of times, and I know a lot of people won't do this, but a lot of times I would train after the game or after a meet, because I still had the endorphins running, and I could play off of that and I could train harder, and I was still going to need time to recover because of the game or the match or meet or whatever I was in. So being able to piggy those together never meant that I had to have more recovery than I would have needed otherwise. So say it was a football game and I beat the shit out of myself and went and trained afterwards. I wasn't going to beat the shit out of myself all that much worse because I was already pretty exhausted and beat up. But come Monday, I was going to feel the same way Monday as I was going to feel if I did train or if I didn't train. So to me, that was always the best time to train. It wasn't the best time for other people I played with because that was the time that they wanted to go out, party, and do all kinds of other shit. I didn't care. So from that standpoint, I was able to always get in 2 serious training sessions a week, and then the other ones they're kind of hit and miss based upon how I was recovering and how I was progressing. And I'm going back a long way here, so I had training partners that were helping me kind of navigate a lot of this as well, so I kind of knew when to pull back, when I could throttle and stuff like that. And I was a hell of a lot younger, so when you're a teenager and early 20s, you can do about fucking anything and still recover. So there's that factor as well.
All right, that's it. Thanks for tuning in.
Cool, guys. Thank you.